do with you during this session is to give a little bit of insight into the peace convention that was held at The Hague in the Netherlands in 1915. That peace convention is documented in my book, The Peacemaker, and the leaders of that convention, Jane Addams and several other women, were part of the women's suffrage movement in this country that began basically in 1848 with the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls. At that time, the women who attended there were concerned about the direction our government was taking, the lack of political rights for females, Native Americans, the wars of aggression that we were fighting, slavery, and they realized that they would have no power over putting an end to these until they became enfranchised and got political power and got the right to vote. At the end of the Civil War, there was a big movement for peace in this country and an end to war. And that movement again was spurred by these ladies who were involved in the suffragette movement. One of those ladies, Julia Ward Howe, wrote the Mother's Day Proclamation for Peace that I read at the beginning of this little clip. So I'm going to read from the book through the voice of the fictional character Molly and her letters to her sister Prudence about what was happening with this convention and what it was all about. Dear Prudence, since this terrible war started in Europe last year, Miss Jane Addams, who, as you know, has been a leader in the reform movement over the past 20 years, has called a meeting in Washington, D.C. to establish a woman's peace party. It appears that our efforts must now move into the international area for the promotion of peace. The purpose of the conference is to call for peace in Europe, put a limitation on armaments and the nationalization of weapons manufacture, and the opposition of militarism in any culture. Ms. Addams also wants to investigate and do away with the government and economic sources of conflict. In order to do this, it is vital that women secure the right to vote. That is why Ms. Addams served as vice president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association from 1911 to 1914. The suffragettes in the territory of Montana have already succeeded in the enfranchisement of women. We are already aware that if the women had the right to vote, we would be more successful in reeling in the power of corrupt government officials that continue to stymie our progress in the reform movement, as well as rein in the power of those who would continue to support an aggressive foreign policy that can only result in the destruction of peace. Ms. Addams thinks it is time we confront our national leaders on these important issues and stage a strong protest. That is why John and I think it is so important to be in Washington at this time. Although you are unable to attend, I am hopeful that you will join the Peace Party and do what you can in Pennsylvania to rally our brothers and sisters in support of this cause. Molly goes to the Washington Convention and then writes another letter to her cousin. I was happy to receive your letter after John and I returned from Washington. Your support for the Women's Peace Party in Pennsylvania is most welcome. The meeting in Washington was very productive. There were over 3,000 women attendees. We approved a platform calling for the extension of suffrage to women and for a conference of neutral countries to propose the idea of continuous mediation as a way of ending war. As you know, this will be the second peace conference held at The Hague. Unfortunately, the conference in 1899 was not successful in preventing war, although it did establish the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Again, I must assert that the arbitration among the nations of the world will not be successful until females are enfranchised. I'm sure you understand this. The empowerment of the women of the Bear Clan was what led to the great peace established by the Iroquois Confederacy. That is why we must continue to strive for political enfranchisement in our country, as well as join with the women of the world who are united in their desire for peace, especially those women who are already living with the horror of war. In fact, one of the women calling for the international conference is a German feminist named Lida Gustava Heimann. The meeting will be held at The Hague in the Netherlands. The Hague is the site of the Peace Palace that was built from money donated by the Carnegie Foundation. The building was especially constructed to house the International Court of Arbitration, where disputes between countries are heard and mediated in hopes of avoiding war. Because of Carl's connection to Andrew Carnegie, John and I have been able to procure passports so that we might travel abroad and attend the public meetings during the conference. We will be sailing on the Dutch ship, the Noordam. That is the same ship that Miss Adams and the rest of the American delegates are using to get to the conference. John and I are hopeful that, even though a state of war exists, our delegates will be able to influence the countries at war to come together and negotiate so that there will be a ceasefire and compromise to settle the conflict through negotiation. Keep this thought in your prayers, and thanks again for all your efforts in Pennsylvania. Despite the grimness of the situation, both at home and abroad, I take comfort from the stories of the Peacemaker. He was able to convince the nations that had been destroyed by years of war to come together in peace. As a result, the darkness was followed by over 400 years of peace and prosperity. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could do the same thing for the children born at the dawn of the new century so that they might experience peace and prosperity?